They step onto coasts no animal has learned to fear, moving with the measured pace of people who follow shorelines for water, driftwood and an open horizon that makes orientation simple. The sand holds their prints until the next tide erases them, but their presence begins to register in more lasting ways. Charcoal in shallow lenses, small hearthstones reddened by heat, shell fragments gathering where meals are taken in quiet repetition. The birds are bold at first, curious and slow to rise. Seals watch from sandbars. Large browsing animals drift through the scrub at the back of the beach, unaccustomed to a primate that carries fire and stone points. Across Pleistocene latitude such meetings unfold again and again as Homo sapiens moves along margins of land and sea, around the Indian Ocean's rim, across exposed continental shelves in glacial lowstands, and into archipelagos whose fauna evolved without human predation. A consensus fact frames this opening scene by at least 50 to 65,000 years ago. Modern humans occupy Sahul, the joined lands of Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, during lower sea levels evidence that people have mastered crossings and literal living long before writing records their roots. On coasts and estuaries they settle into routines that leave readable traces, stacks of shells with cut edges, fish vertebrae split by cooking burned seeds from plants gathered along brackish margins, and the occasional bone of a land animal bearing the neat scoring of butchery. They do not write the story of these places, but the sediments do. In some beaches now, far inland, ancient dunes preserve faint soil horizons, dusted with charcoal thin but persistent, suggesting repeated small fires in landscapes where lightning is rare. In others, middens layer slowly over centuries the shell shining with salt that once lay beyond the surf line, now stranded by shifting coasts. A lesser-known detail emerges from the southern continents. Fragments of giant bird eggshell, weathered pale and cross-hatched by heat, lie in low numbers among hearth debris, their carbonate altered in ways consistent with cooking. Whether each fragment testifies to a meal or to curiosity is unknowable, but together they speak of a human habit of sampling new foods in new places. The people move inland and back, testing freshwater reaches and headlands, finding where tidal pools replenish, where seabirds nest most densely, where larger prey cuts across dunes at dawn. With every return nearby, animals learn or fail to learn new rules of approach and flight. Some species tolerate the novelty too long. Others drift from the shore behind brush lines, becoming less visible, harder to find, shifting energy budgets in ways that ripple through the web of predation. The unresolved mystery that shadows these first landings is the pace and mechanism of loss. Do extinctions follow directly from hunting naive animals, or do they arrive by a composite path of habitat? Change fire used to open scrub for visibility, competition for resources at water points, and altered predator guilds as humans take their share. In some sequences, bones of large mammals disappear within a few millennia of human traces. In others, decline is staggered and uneven, the timing indistinct against climatic swings. Without words, the interaction remains to be inferred from residues, and those residues suggest that people act not as a cataclysmic instant, but as a persistent pressure that landscapes must absorb or fail to withstand. On a planetary scale, ice locks water into high-latitude sheets, and the ocean lowers bearing shelves the size of small continents. Coastlines extend outward in broad, gentle plains, and archipelagos connect by stepping stone sand ridges or short crossings that raft makers can manage with driftwood and plant fibre. Wind patterns shift with the cold, moving dry air across subtropical belts. Monsoons contract and expand. Kelp forests thicken, along some margins thinning along others, making routes both richer in nearshore food and more navigable by the predictable texture of the sea. When the world warms again, the sea returns, drowning the first camps and hearths, and turning many early shorelines into submerged archives. The people read these changes by practice rather than by text, moving camps upslope, choosing different landings, timing journeys to the steady pull of tides and the wide cycles of season. In their wake, the record shows small fires, where there were few before ash, that settles into peat and plant communities that shift towards species that resprout after burning. Far inland, where river mouths braided through now drowned plains, the same human signature appears in lighter form: cut bones in floodplain silts, hearths on natural levees, and napping floors where translucent stone shatters into flakes that glint when touched by angled light. The animals respond each within its own bounds of behavior and reproduction. Long-lived giants with slow breeding cycles prove especially vulnerable to a predator that can remember, plan, and coordinate. Yet the scene at the shore remains quiet. Without spectacle, a group gathers shellfish. A hunter tests a spear in the shallows at dusk. Children bring driftwood to a banked fire that will keep sparks through night. The changes that begin here are cumulative, not sudden, and they travel with people as surely as baskets, cords, and stories do. A scale reference hides in the horizon, distances from a beach on a large shelf. The line of wading at low tide might extend farther than a day's walk. The next island is a darker smudge across a channel that can be crossed in a morning if the wind holds steady. Within a few seasons, the route stitched from such crossings reaches a span longer than from one inland sea to another, and each landfall repeats the same first meetings between humans and animals that have not yet priced a new predator into their instincts. Evidence for these movements accumulates unevenly thicker, where caves trap ash, and food remains sparse where dunes migrate and rivers erase banks. But the pattern resolves when viewed broadly. Timing of first human arrival and timing of faunal decline often overlap in the same narrow windows, even as local climates shift. The people at the waterline do not know they are entering a chapter that later scholars will call a mass extinction. They know only that new coasts present new combinations of hunger, opportunity, and caution, and that fire is a tool that changes what grows and what returns after cutting. On nights with clear air, they watch bioluminescent curls lift from their paddles and wonder at the slow swell of the tide. On mornings after landfall, they study tracks in damp sand with the same quiet concentration they give to a fresh napping surface. The story that begins here does not need words to proceed. It needs only a repeated presence, a set of practices, and the inexhaustible patience of landscapes to record outcomes in layers that reach the present. In the open grasslands of Soothe, the role of fire grows more deliberate, its effect more visible. Humans carry embers from camp to camp, setting low creeping burns that leave blackened swathes across the pale stubble. Within weeks, fresh green shoots push through, attracting grazing wallabies and smaller kangaroos, but the great browsers, diprotodon giant wombats, and the towering flightless birds respond differently. Some avoid the burned ground, entirely moving into shrinking pockets of unburned woodland. Others return too slowly, their breeding cycles outpaced by the changes humans introduce. Archaeological layers from this period often contain fine charcoal mixed with the remains of grass seeds, suggesting that fire not only altered hunting conditions, but also provided access to food plants whose seeds could be gathered in abundance after burning. A lesser-known detail comes from a lakeshore midden where burned fragments of giant bird eggshell lie among fish bones and stone flakes. The eggshell bears tiny heat cracks consistent with roasting evidence that humans took both the birds and their offspring. Yet it remains an unresolved mystery how quickly these practices transformed ecosystems. Did fire alone combined with selective hunting steadily thin populations, or were there abrupt collapses linked to drought years when both humans and animals crowded scarce water? At the planetary scale, the timing is bound into the last glacial cycle, when polar ice still holds vast volumes of water and global temperatures remain cooler than today. This cold world is not uniform in some tropical belts. Rainfall patterns weaken shrinking wetlands and shortening the flood cycles that sustain inland lakes. Winds sweep fine dust across open country, coating leaves and settling in low depressions where seeds once gathered thick. In this shifting climate, the human imprint works alongside natural stressors, nudging some species beyond recovery. Camps remain small, but they are persistent. Hearthstones reddened by repeated heating mark favoured sites near water. Napping floors glitter with discarded flakes of quartzite and chert. Piles of split bones lie where meat was stripped and marrow removed. Children and elders pick over burned ground for fresh shoots and seeds, while hunters scan the horizon for movement, their silhouettes mirrored by birds of prey circling above. The movement across the land has its own rhythm, a loop that covers days on foot, crossing plains where mirages shimmer, climbing low rises for vantage descending to riverbeds that hold water in shaded bends even in the dry months. The people know these routes as intimately as the backs of their hands, each bend and hollow, carrying stories told beside evening fires. Over time, the grasslands lose some of their largest inhabitants, the absence noticed first as longer intervals between sightings, then as only bone fragments found in old camps, then not at all. The changes are quiet but final. Along the edges of the great interior lakes where wind-scoured beaches meet reed beds, human presence settles into a seasonal pattern. When the waters recede in the dry months, mudflats crack underfoot, exposing stranded fish and shellfish that can be gathered without nets. Birds descend in great numbers to feed their calls carrying across the open water, and hunters wait in shallow blinds of grass. Archaeological evidence shows that by 40,000 years ago these lake margins bared dense scatters of stone flakes, bone and burned seed husks, signs of repeated organised use. A lesser-known detail comes from one such lake where sediment cores reveal alternating layers of fine silt and charcoal. The pattern suggests not random burning, but regular low-intensity fires set at times when vegetation could recover, creating a mosaic of habitats that drew game close to water. Whether this pattern was intentional ecosystem management or simply a byproduct of clearing camp areas remains an unresolved question. The planetary context frames these local acts within a broader glacial world. Global sea levels remain low, inland rainfall patterns fluctuate, and some lakes swell to vast expanses while others shrink to saline pools. As climate oscillates, the consistency of human visits marked by hearths and cut bones becomes a stabilizing force in certain habitats, even as it pressures vulnerable species. Herd animals still move through, but the largest and slowest breeders decline first. Diprotodon bones, once common in shoreline deposits, become rarer in the upper layers. The giant birds too appear less frequently, their eggshell fragments confined to older fire pits. Camps at the water's edge are modest but efficient hearthstones arranged to block wind cooking fires, ringed with cracked mussel shells, drying racks propped between forked branches. Children help gather seeds from grass heads that ripen after fire, shaking them into woven bags. Women grind the seeds on flat stones, the rhythm of the work steady and unhurried. Men check fish traps set in narrowing channels, lifting them in the cool of morning before the sun climbs. A scale reference lives in the lake itself at its full. A crossing by canoe from one shore to the other might take the better part of a day, the far bank a thin grey line against the pale sky. Now, during the dry season, that same route can be walked in hours, the receding water leaving salt traces on cracked clay. the landscape records each human return in ash, stone and bone, even as the living witnesses the largest animals fade from the scene. Across the northern grasslands and wooded river corridors, the arrival of humans changes patterns older than memory. Herds of browsing marsupials and grazing kangaroos, once moving freely between open pasture and forest edge, now encounter regular disturbance, the scent of smoke, the sound of tools striking stone, the presence of hunters along their habitual paths. Archaeological sites in these regions yield a mix of species remains, bones of giant wombats, wallabies, and smaller mammals, showing that people take a wide range of prey, yet the largest animals remain disproportionately represented in the oldest layers. A lesser-known detail appears in a site where the bones of a giant wombat species preserved in clay bear parallel cut marks close to the joint surfaces, a sign of deliberate disarticulation for meat removal. Whether these large animals are targeted intentionally or opportunistically is still an unresolved debate, but the consistent association with human tools suggests a clear interaction. On the planetary scale, the timing of these events overlaps with a period of glacial cooling and heightened climatic variability. Monsoon belts shift rainfall patterns, fragment and long, drought intervals become more frequent in some regions, stressing plant growth and forcing both animals and humans to adapt their ranges. In this environmental mosaic, human fire setting intensifies certain transitions, opening patches of grass in dense woodland and creating edges where new plant growth attracts grazers, while simultaneously reducing cover for species that avoid open ground. Camps in these northern zones often cluster near river bends where freshwater persists longest into the dry season. Hearths are arranged on sandy banks and tools are napped from river cobbles, their flakes left glittering in the dust. Smoke from cooking fires drifts over the water, mingling with the calls of birds gathering to drink. Daily activity is shared, some tend fires and prepare food. Others check traps for fish or small mammals. Elders teach the shapes of tracks pressed into damp sand. Travel between seasonal camps follows a rhythm linked to resource peaks. Fruiting trees along the river in one season, wallaby-rich grasslands in another. A subtle scale reference lies in these journeys, the round trip from one favoured river loop to the next, may be more than the span of a modern province, yet it is traversed on foot, guided by remembered landmarks and the lay of the land. Over years and decades, the composition of these riverine ecosystems shifts. The largest herbivores appear less often, their absence changing plant growth patterns and altering the frequency with which certain areas burn naturally. The human imprint remains steady, etched into both the physical record and the living memory of the people who walk these routes, even as some of the creatures they once knew become figures only in stories. Along the southern coasts, where rolling plains meet wind-lashed cliffs, human groups arrive seasonally to exploit the rich interface of land and sea. Tides expose rocky shelves crowded with shellfish, and fish shoals gather near kelp forests in the shallows. Inland low forests shelter grazing animals, including the now vanishing giant marsupials that once roamed from beach to woodland without pause. Archaeological deposits in coastal rock shelters preserve the overlapping signs of these activities, shell middens layered with charcoal stone tools and the occasional bone of a large extinct species. A lesser-known detail comes from one such shelter, where marine shells lie in direct association with the bones of giant kangaroos, implying a broad-spectrum diet gathered from two very different environments in the same occupation phase. The unresolved question for researchers is whether these coastal visits are brief opportunistic forays or part of a larger migratory circuit linking multiple ecosystems over the year. At the planetary scale, sea levels remain more than 100 meters lower than today, the coastline extending far beyond the present cliffs into what are now submerged plains. The expanded coastal shelf provides vast foraging grounds, but it is also more exposed to wind and seasonal storms shaping when and how people move along it. Camps here differ from inland sites. They are often temporary windbreaks built from driftwood and seaweed, close to both freshwater and tidal zones. Fires burn with a smoky tang from damp wood, and drying racks of fish and meat stand where wind and sun can reach them. Children help gather limpets and small crabs from tide pools, while hunters range inland for wallabies or watch for seabirds nesting on cliff ledges. The rhythm of life here is tuned to the lunar cycle, the tides dictating when the richest harvests can be made. A subtle scale reference is found in the visible horizon standing on the ancient coastal plain. A traveller can see land stretching far seaward, where now only open ocean lies, a reminder of how much of the world's water is locked in polar ice. Over time, even in these abundant zones, signs of decline emerge. The bones of large marsupials become rarer in younger deposits, replaced by smaller, faster reproducing species. Charcoal continues to appear in sediment layers, evidence that fire is still used to shape inland edges and perhaps drive game, but the mix of species in those layers shifts. What remains constant is the human pattern, returning to the coast, taking from both sea and land, leaving behind the middens and hearths that will one day speak for a way of life, in which the presence of giants was fading into the past. On remote islands scattered across rising seas, the first human arrivals bring change that the resident species have never faced. Many of these islands, cut off from continents for millions of years, hold flightless birds, slow-breeding reptiles and small mammals unaccustomed to predators of human size and strategy. Archaeological remains on such islands, stone flakes, shell, middens, and hearth charcoal are often found alongside the bones of species that disappear soon after. A lesser-known detail comes from an island cave where thick layers of guano and wind-blown sand preserved the skeletons of a large flightless rail. In upper layers associated with human tools, these bones are charred, suggesting roasting. Whether the disappearance of these species was due entirely to direct hunting, or also to the arrival of commensal animals like rats and dogs that accompanied humans, remains unresolved. On the planetary scale, these events unfold during a time when ice still binds the poles, keeping sea levels low and exposing island chains that will later shrink or vanish beneath waves. As climate warms in, pulses, shorelines retreat, reducing habitat for both humans and animals, and making inter-island voyages longer and riskier. Camps on these islands are small and transient, often sited near freshwater springs or sheltered bays. Driftwood fires burn low, their smoke drifting inland, while fish dry on racks and baskets of shellfish sit ready for cooking. Multiple tasks happen at once. Some gather eggs from ground nests, others check fish traps in the shallows, and hunters move inland in search of the larger birds or reptiles that still linger in undisturbed thickets. The composition of the camp mirrors the constraints of the island, no vast herds to pursue, but a rich mix of smaller localized resources. A subtle scale reference emerges in the visible horizon from a high ridge. One can see the silhouettes of other islands in the chain, a day's paddling away in favourable weather, each holding its own unique community of life. Over decades, the repeated visits leave an unmistakable signature. Charcoal flecks in soil shells piled in heaps, and the gradual disappearance of species that once defined the island's ecology. What remains is a quieter, altered landscape where the absence of certain calls or footprints is as telling as any artifact left behind. When humans first enter the vast interior of the Americas, the land holds an extraordinary range of large mammals, mammoths grazing on steppe-like grasslands, mastodons browsing in conifer forests, giant ground sloths moving deliberately through river valleys. Archaeological evidence shows that within a relatively short span after human arrival, these animals begin to vanish from the record. Sites on the Great Plains preserve mammoth kill areas, where stone spear points lie among ribs and vertebrae bearing cut marks. A lesser-known detail comes from a lakeside site, where the bones of a giant beaver over 2 meters long in life are found alongside human tools, suggesting interaction with species beyond the well-known proboscideans. Whether the rapid disappearance of so many large mammals was caused primarily by human hunting or by climate shifts at the end of the last ice age remains an unresolved question, but the timing of human expansion and the extinctions is strikingly close. On the planetary scale, these events occur during a period of dramatic warming, with ice sheets retreating, sea levels rising, and vegetation zones shifting hundreds of kilometers in a few centuries. This upheaval creates new habitats in some regions but erases old ones in others, forcing both people and animals into novel configurations of range and competition. Camps on the plains are often positioned near water sources, springs, river bends, or the shores of glacial lakes. Fires burn through the night to keep away predators. Hides are stretched on frames drying in the wind. Groups work together, some butcher, others scrape hides, while younger members gather wood or carry water. Hunting here requires coordination over wide distances. Drives funnel animals toward waiting hunters armed with points hafted to long spears. A subtle scale reference lies in the migrations themselves, the routes humans follow from ice-front refuges to southern grasslands can stretch farther than the span between modern nations yet are walked within a lifetime. Over years, as the great herds thin, hunting strategies shift towards smaller game and more reliance on fishing and plant gathering, the landscape changes in tandem. Grasslands once clipped by the feeding of mammoths and bison grow differently. Certain plants spread where heavy grazers are gone. In the archaeological layers the tools remain, but the bones tell a quieter story. The larger species gone, their absence leaving a long echo in both ecology and human memory. In many regions, the story of these extinctions is recorded not only in bones and tools, but in the altered structure of entire ecosystems. As humans adapt to the absence of the largest animals, their subsistence patterns change, and so too do the plant and animal communities around them. In temperate woodlands, once home to browsing mastodons, young trees grow more densely, no longer kept in check by the tearing and trampling of massive herbivores. Wetlands once grazed open by giant ground sloths, and proboscideans fill with shrubs and peat, altering water flow and the mix of bird and insect life. Archaeological evidence from these regions often shows an increasing reliance on smaller mammals, birds, and freshwater fish, alongside the continued gathering of nuts, seeds, and tubers. A lesser-known detail comes from a riverside site, where the remains of freshwater mussels are found in great quantity, mixed with the bones of turtles and ducks, an indication that humans began focusing on highly localized renewable food sources as large game declined. The unresolved question for scientists is how quickly these shifts occurred and whether they were driven more by necessity or by opportunistic adaptation to new resource patterns. On the planetary scale, these local ecological changes are part of a broader reorganization of life at the end of the Pleistocene, as warming climates, melting ice, and human activity combine to reshape the biosphere. Camps in this period show signs of greater permanence in some areas. Post holes for shelters, storage pits for dried meat or plant foods, suggesting that reduced mobility sometimes follows the narrowing of available large game ranges. Social activities remain communal, multiple individuals work on processing food, repairing tools, or teaching skills to younger members. Fire continues to be central for warmth cooking and the quiet light it provides in long evenings. A subtle scale reference emerges in the seasonal movements that remain, though reduced, they still span distances from inland valleys to coastal estuaries, ensuring access to varied resources. Over generations, oral traditions may keep alive the memory of animals no longer seen, their shapes and behaviours preserved in stories told by the fire. In the archaeological record, however, the shift is clear. The largest bones vanish from the youngest layers, replaced by a diversity of smaller species, each carrying forward a fragment of the abundance that once characterized these landscapes. By the close of this great wave of losses, human communities live in landscapes profoundly changed from those first entered generations before. Where once herds of immense animals roamed, the largest remaining game are now deer, antelope, or wild cattle, wary and swift. The absence of megafauna alters not only the food web, but the human relationship with the land. In some regions, the lack of large grazers allows grass to grow taller and more prone to fire. In others, thickets expand, sheltering smaller animals but making travel more difficult. Archaeological layers from this time often contain more grinding stones and plant processing tools, showing that seeds and roots take a greater role in the diet. A lesser-known detail emerges from a site where carbonized wild gourds are found in a storage pit, their tough rinds perhaps used as containers, as well as food, a sign of ingenuity and resource use. The unresolved question is whether these changes in diet and toolkits arise primarily from scarcity, or from a growing mastery of local environments that no longer depend on the chase of giants. On the planetary scale, climates continue to warm into the early Holocene ice sheets, now much diminished coastlines advancing inland and sea levels, swallowing the continental shelves that once extended migration routes. Human settlements respond in varied ways. Some remain mobile, shifting camps with the seasons. Others establish semi-permanent villages near rivers, lakes, or coasts, securing reliable access to water and diverse foods. In such villages, activity as shared groups repair shelters, craft ornaments from bone and shell, and tend small plots where useful plants may be encouraged to grow. Fires still mark the heart of social life, their smoke curling into the evening air, while stories preserve the memory of animals long gone, sometimes naming places for them, though they no longer walk there. A subtle scale reference can be seen in the seasonal gathering points that draw people from days or weeks away, linking smaller communities into larger networks. Over centuries, the traces of this time-hearth circles, tool scatters, shell heaps, become the enduring record of an era when humanity's reach altered the balance of life on every continent entered. The great animals of the past live on only in fossils and artifacts, their absence shaping the paths humans take into the next chapters of prehistory. Role. You're a visual scene selector and historical prompt writer, specializing in